Thank you so much to the Reason Foundation for hosting this. My name is Christian Fords, and I'm a research fellow at the Independent Institute and director of the California Golden Fleece Awards. The Independent Institute is a nonprofit public policy organization based in Oakland, California, dedicated to implementing sound economic reforms and advocating for sound principles of a just and free society. Next year will be our 40th year anniversary. We are here tonight to discuss the LA Metro and all the problems associated with that public transportation system. I am here with Baruch Feigenbaum. Well, going back, the project that I oversee is called the California Golden Fleece Awards. It is a project dedicated to exposing waste, fraud, and abuse in California. So any entity, policy, or law that is fleecing California taxpayers is subject to receive the California Golden Fleece Awards. So these reports are issued quarterly. We have issued Golden Fleece Awards to BART, to LA Metro, to Proposition 103, California's failed homeowners insurance market. And when we were brainstorming ideas, the LA Metro was an obvious natural fit for the Fleece Award. So when we were looking into authors, Baruch Feigenbaum agreed to write a report on the LA Metro, and he agreed to write a report for us. So Baruch Feigenbaum is Senior Managing Director of Transportation Policy at Reason Foundation. He has a diverse background researching and implementing transportation issues, including revenue and finance, public-private partnerships, highways, transit, high-speed rail, ports, intelligent transportation systems, land use, and local policymaking. Prior to joining Reason, Feigenbaum handled transportation issues on Capitol Hill for Representative Lynn Westmoreland. So thank you so much, Baruch, for the work that you've done for the Independent Institute. And we are going to have an enjoyable conversation exploring why the Los Angeles Metro has been such a failure to taxpayers.
Well, thank you very much. And I think it sounds like my mom actually wrote that bio for me because it was very nice. So by the way, can everyone hear me in the back? Okay, very good.
Yes. So the first question, Baruch, is why is the LA Metro the recipient of the Golden Fleece Awards? Can we go back to the beginning? Can we talk about the history of LA Metro? How did this transportation system begin, and how has it evolved over the years?
Well, those are a lot of questions. So let me do my best in a few minutes here because we've only got an hour. So basically, the LA transit system actually goes back to the 1800s. And in the early 1900s, it was comprised largely of streetcars. And since then, about 200 privately owned and operated transit companies came and went, including during the Great Merger of 1911. In 1951, the Chamber of Commerce was working to get a sister or a successor agency, the Los Angeles Metropolitan Transit Authority. There's been so many different agencies, I should say, through the years that I have to make note of them because it's hard to keep them straight, and not necessarily that much has changed. In 1964, that became the Southern California Rapid Transit District. Again, a number of other transit agencies, namely bus operating agencies, were bought in order to make this occur. There was still, though, and really since right after World War II, there was a desire for rail transit in LA. And even 30 years later, in 1976, there was still no rail transit. And so then we created a Los Angeles County Transportation Commission and started with Proposition A and fees, impact, going ahead and including a provision for a 50-cent bus fare to try to increase ridership and moving it to different agencies. Finally, the agency as we know it was created in 1992 with a combination of two other agencies. And so there's long been this desire for rail transit in LA. And the problem is, which I'll get into a little bit later, I think, is that rail transit doesn't make a heck of a lot of sense. And so because of this, LA Metro has been expanding its rail lines and cutting its bus lines and basically getting more and more sales tax revenue. The sales tax that goes to the transit system has increased over time. But we haven't seen a functional system that serves the folks who actually take transit in LA County. And that, combined with some crime issues, combined with some cost overruns, combined with some union issues, is basically why the system got the award. It's just a combination of poor decision-making by the executive leadership over the years.
So when we look at LA Metro system, how would you say that it compares to other public transit systems, both in the nation and across the world? Would you say that it does well compared to other systems, or how does it stack up?
Boy, if that's ever a slam dunk question, uh, I would say it does not do well compared to other systems. It's just some numbers here. So LA Metro carries fewer than 1 million people a day. And that includes folks who are taking multiple rides, as many as 4 rides in a county with 10 million people. New York City, on the other hand, has more than 10 million rides. So basically 12 times as many. Seoul, South Korea, a city comparable or region comparable in size, more or less, has 7 million rides. London, 13 million. Paris, 12 million. Tokyo, 6.5. So the answer is it just doesn't, the ridership is just not there. The population density is also a factor. It lags most of the other places that I mentioned, particularly the European and Asian cities. And then the cost per mile to build transit is $900 million per mile. The only place that is at all comparable is Paris. And I don't want to make anyone mad by saying that LA is not Paris, but LA is not Paris in many ways. I should add that New York City, it's only 450 million a mile. So basically LA is more than twice. And Seoul is able to do it for 300 million a mile. So fewer riders, higher capital costs, not a good combination.
So I want to go back to the cost in just a minute here, but I will say that as a lifelong Los Angeles resident, I lived here for over 18 years. The biggest condemnation of the LA Metro, in my opinion, is the fact that I had never taken it before starting this research project. Despite the fact that I spent my whole life here, it just never provided any organic utility, and I never found myself on it, which you said 1 million per year. That does not surprise me at all. In my personal peer network in LA, I cannot think of many people I know who have personally ridden it.
Yes. Well, I have written it. I did a comprehensive report on improving mobility in the region back in 2015 that we released at Reason Foundation. So I got to experience it, but it's got this problem of being incredibly expensive and yet not going where a lot of people need to go. And so when it doesn't go where you need it to go, you're not going to take it because it doesn't meet your needs. And it's really that simple. And some of it gets into how LA is structured, which I'll get into a little bit later, but it just does not work for many folks who live in the county.
So going back to these staggering costs, what exactly are the contributing factors behind 900 million per mile?
Well, some of it is that all transit projects in this country are incredibly expensive. It's interesting to me that many European cities who we see as having stricter environmental rules, stronger unions, etc., are still able to build comparable systems at half the cost. And some of that comes down to how we build projects, our construction methods, lack of private sector participation, often in the right places. Some of it comes down to just trying to think of how to phrase this, management that could be better. How about that in terms of overall managing the project? Also, political interference, for lack of a better word. We'll have projects that are designed a certain way, and then in order to get stakeholder support very late in the process, there are changes made to those projects, which tend to cause change orders and increase costs. Now, you need to get community buy-in, obviously, in a project, but there's a time to do that and a time not to do that. And waiting until after you've actively started the project, certainly the pre-construction activities, is not the time to do it.
So we'll discuss solutions later on, but just offhand, is there anything you can think of like immediately that comes to mind to reduce the cost of the LA Metro?
I think, I'll mention these later, but I think the agency needs to focus more on buses. I think they need to make better use of public-private partnerships, and I think they need to overhaul their project selection methods.
So moving on to some of the other problems, what would you say are the 3 or 4 biggest problems facing the LA Metro?
Yeah. So I thought about this a while because there's more than 3 or 4, but here are the 4 that I think are the biggest problems. And I'm gonna be really tired of me talking about this by the end of this hour, but I think it's really important. Focus on what we call transit dependent riders, not transit choice riders. So transit dependent riders tend to be lower income folks they tend to, and these are all tends, not absolute, to use bus systems more than rail systems. They tend to ride the system more because they, by definition, depend on it. It's not where they want to go live next to a line because they think it's attractive to look at, which it might be, but that's not great for ridership. And along with that, not only more bus service, but more demand responsive transit. So demand responsive transit can be like Uber. It can be microtransit, which is a flexible service. It can be anything basically that is not a fixed route service. And the reason why that's important is because there's a lot of places in the county that cannot justify fixed route service that have it right now. And it's basically a large bus for a small number of people. It's not a good investment. Competition have de facto monopolies. Other buses cannot actually stop at the LA Metro bus stops legally because they are basically competing, and LA Metro has been given, as a government service, the exclusive operating rights. And that is a in lower quality because there's no competition. And then I would also say unions. Unions tend to not be big fans of competition or innovation because it can threaten the number of workers. It can also threaten the union management, shall we say. And there are ways. I mean, California is obviously a strong union state, but there are some ways around that.
So going back to what you said earlier about transit-dependent riders, it just baffles my mind. Why would we have a public transit system that built routes that cater to anyone other than the people who were using it?
Yes. Well, I shall explain. So if I'm an elected official, the folks who are supporting me are generally going to be the wealthier folks in the community, the ones with connections, and those folks tend to ride rail. So I need to make sure that in any expansion, I'm giving those folks what they want. Whereas the transit dependent riders tend to be poor, don't show up to public meetings, don't go to their elected officials' events because they've probably got something like work they've got to do. And so they don't get as much of a say. And so it's really a political situation more than a policy decision. And look, LA Metro may be frustrating, but they're not stupid. Okay. They know who has the purse strings and they know they've got to please those folks. I think there are some other options other than these really expensive rail lines that they could roll out, but that is the reason.
It's very interesting. What would you recommend so that the people who actually use public transit could have more political capital, to use that terminology, in order to bring about a better system? Should there be some sort of way to increase political participation among those groups? In other words, is there a way to overcome the incentive problem that politicians have in Los Angeles?
I think you have to change the incentive structure and who is making the decisions. Because until you do that, I don't see another feasible way where this is going to change. This has been going on since basically 1990, so 35 years. There have been attempts to change the system. There was a lawsuit filed by a bus riders group who basically said, LA Metro is building all of these rail lines and fewer people are taking them, and they are cutting our bus service because they could no longer afford to operate it. This is not what they're supposed to be doing. They won that lawsuit. The judge in the case put a consent decree on LA Metro to operate more buses and stop expanding the rail program temporarily. That happened. Overall ridership in the system surged. The buses were full, and it was very successful. Until the consent decree expired, LA Metro went back to doing what it had done before, which was expanding its rail line. It wanted to build out a rail line, couldn't afford to operate the buses. They cut buses, ridership decreased. They cut buses again, ridership decreased. What's known in the transit world as a death spiral. And here we are. So short of changing the actors or the motivation, I don't see another realistic way.
And you briefly mentioned crime earlier. Could you elaborate a little bit about the situation on the LA Metro? Like, what is it like? What sort of dangers and risk do riders face on a daily basis?
Yeah, I mean, it's like not good. Now it is. I'm. Yeah, I mean, there was a period of time last year where there was something like in a period of 30 days or something like that, 15 violent incidents, which is crazy. And I mean violent. I mean like stabbings and murders. Okay, totally unacceptable. Totally unacceptable for anyone who was thinking of riding the system. I guarantee you, they saw the news in the LA Times and they're like, LA Metro did redo its police. They actually got their dedicated police force, which basically every other major transit system has. The numbers improved somewhat, but it's still per capita one of the most dangerous systems in the country. And they track different crimes. They track like crimes against people, uh, violent crimes they call something else, crimes against equipment, people who are defacing equipment. They're all above average in terms of being worse than average. That's not above average, but you know what I mean. So it's improving, but it's still a problem. And I will say, even if you're like, well, yeah, there's crime everywhere. Okay. It's an image problem because if you see something, you are much less likely to ride it. So if they are trying to get new ridership and something, got an article about man gets stabbed on Green Line, well, that's not going to help.
So I'd be curious to hear your thoughts about a theory I have after taking the LA Metro. During the course of this research project, as I mentioned, I took the LA Metro for the first time in my entire life, and I was rather shocked by the things I saw in there. Those of you who have studied economics may be familiar with something called the Groucho Marx effect. Groucho Marx was a comedian who effectively says that he would never join a club that would allow people like him to join it, saying like that club must not be very high quality to let someone like me in. In my opinion, the LA Metro is sort of subject to a Groucho Marx effect. There's an incentive problem. When you have a city in which public transportation is really not effective, the only people that are going to be using it, for the most part, are going to be using it for other purposes. So when I went on the LA Metro, this is not an exaggeration, it seemed to me like 70% of the people on there appeared to be homeless, which I can imagine creates a more dangerous situation. And it also creates a situation in which there are almost no bystanders to prevent incidents like the ones you talk about from occurring if something were to break out.
So homelessness on transit systems is a problem, especially homelessness on transit systems in cities with nice climates. Uh, I actually think there's a couple of different ways you can enforce that. You can have a little bit more police presence on the system to make sure the folks who are there are the ones that are supposed to be there. You could also look at what we would call as a closed system. And so on the East Coast systems, there are turnstiles, and you actually have to swipe in and swipe out, and the gates are high. And so getting onto the system is very challenging. I'm not saying you can't do it, but it's very challenging. Whereas LA Metro has a lot of open access lines, which are basically paying the fare is on an honor system. And, well, you could imagine why that might not work so well is because some have more honor than others, but also folks who are just looking for a place, they're homeless, they're looking for a place to sleep or whatever. There's no barrier to them. And, look, homeless is a tough problem. I'm not here to get into the sociology aspects of it, but obviously when you have a lot of folks who appear, to not be well kept, that is also something that scares off riders.
So you've discussed several of the very serious problems that are plaguing the LA Metro, and you've briefly mentioned some of the solutions, but out of everything, what would you say are the most important recommendations for LA Metro to implement?
Well, so the full report, should you choose to read it, um, if you're really interested in this topic, you'll love it. And if you're not interested in this topic, it might make some good bedtime reading. But it has 19 recommendations, and I'm going to argue they're all important. But here are the 7. I chose 7 because that's where I thought the cutoff was, that are the most important. So, focusing on customers. LA Metro is, as we've discussed, not real focused on their customers. They're focused on other people. Choosing bus rapid transit, which we haven't discussed much, but we can, over light rail, which is a cheaper technology with some of the same benefits. I would like to see LA Metro board members have some transportation knowledge. And some folks will debate me on this, but I'm not looking for experts here. I'm looking for some knowledge. I would like to see them forego federal funding for new capital projects. Federal funding comes with strings. You have to do, labor intensive. That's even more than California. You have to do, prescribed processes that generally tend to increase costs. I'd like to see them examine contracting out in P3 services. LA Metro, most of the services operate in-house. Most transit agencies contract out with the private sector for more services. I'd like to see alternatives that are actually able to compete. I mentioned Uber and microtransit before. That would need to be a policy change at the local level. And then we also talked about the increased police presence to make sure that there's not violent crime or such happening on the system.
I remember in the first conversation that Baruch and I ever had about the LA Metro, we were discussing how it's a big misallocation of taxpayer resources, how it's never going to work in a city like LA. And I asked Baruch, why can't you just shut the system down entirely? And he revealed to me that if you receive federal funding, the projects must continue perpetually. They cannot be shut down after receiving federal funding unless the federal government decides to shut them down. Is that correct, Baruch?
Right. The only way that you can shut down a system that's got even $1 of federal funding is if you repay all of that money back to the federal government. And LA Metro does not have the money to pay back to the federal government.
So this means that even if there were 0 riders on the LA Metro, it was the worst public transportation system in the world, it could never be shut down. It would continue to operate and continue to cost the taxpayers immense amounts of money, correct?
That's correct. And the justification for this was that if we're the federal government and we're giving you money, you're going to operate this system. I don't know that the folks who made those rules back then envisioned some of the systems that would actually be created.
So you listed 7 of the most important recommendations. So my question is, are there any other cities, either nationally or around the world, that implement those recommendations? Does New York City, for example?
Well, I wouldn't say New York City is the best example, but let me, and I should note there is no city or region that implements all of these, but I want to focus on some of them that are being implemented, just so you think I didn't come down from my glass tower to come up with crazy ideas. So WMATA, which is the transit agency in Washington, D.C., and MARTA, which is the transit agency in Atlanta, both heavy rail systems, so similar to several of the lines on the LA system, made policy decisions to stop building rail lines and start building bus-based alternatives. They both officially put it in. Neither of them is planning to build any new rail lines in the next 50 years. Of course, plans can change, and in fact, in a column that I wrote, I noted that LA Metro was actually an outlier in the number of rail lines it was planning to build, and that no other United States city had plans for near as extensive a system. Maybe 1 or 2 lines here or there, not near. Yes.
You mentioned changing incentive for board members or whoever's all in transit system. How would you envision tensions?
So I think part of it would be changing who's on the board. So you actually have people on the board that are serving the ride. Part of it is changing the way both the state and local level. So you were only given funding to programs and projects that prioritized the type of folks who are actually writing the system. I guess those would be my top. Those would be my top 2, because I think agencies follow the money. And if they can't get money for a lot of these projects, even here in LA where the system gets a lot of local funding, they still rely rather heavily on the federal and state for capital funding for new expansion. And so if you change how they're given funding and who's making those decisions, I think it can make a pretty significant difference. So other systems, let's see. Many agencies have selectively forgoed federal funding for some projects because it increased the cost. So it wouldn't be out of the realm of possibility for some to do that. Private contracting is much more viable. We've seen DART in Dallas do a lot with private contracting for Uber and Lyft for what we call first mile, last mile. So they're not putting a fixed route transit in areas that don't make sense. In fact, having a better relationship with ride hailing services, I think, is important as well. And so many systems have done some of these things.
So you mentioned earlier about the incentives for politicians in Los Angeles to prioritize rail over bus. Would you mind briefly explaining to the audience why rail is such a bad idea in Los Angeles and how residency distributions but also zoning restrictions contributed to that?
Yes, that's a lot. You may have to prompt me here.
No problem.
So basically, LA is a very unique place. And I don't mean that in a bad or good way. LA is a unique place. It is actually the densest urban area in the US, denser than New York, denser than San Francisco. But it has this, what I call non-functional density, which means it's medium density through a large area, but there's no high or very high density. Rail lines make sense in areas with high or very high density. So Midtown Manhattan, high or very high. San Francisco, many parts of the city itself. Washington, D.C., parts of the downtown area. So because of this, and LA leaders have tried to densify the city to some extent, I suppose, in downtown, but it's largely not successful. And because of geographic boundaries and whatever, it's a challenge. And so basically, you can customize buses to make them work in less dense places, which you have in LA. And that is why they're more effective, because you're never going to get what we would call crush loads at rush hour that you need to make a heavy rail system anywhere near cost effective like you get in Midtown Manhattan. It's just not going to happen.
That makes complete sense to me. And so correct me if I'm wrong about this, but one of the biggest issues when Los Angeles was developed is the fact that we do have single family zoning like a lot of the US. So there was no option to build up in LA. You had to build outwards instead. That was the only option that developers had. And as we saw with the Eaton fire, Altadena was a low-cost area. People that couldn't afford traditional mortgages, a lot of African-American families ended up in Altadena. Because there was no option to build affordable housing upwards, it went outwards instead. And eventually that housing reached very dangerous areas, the wildland-urban interface. But effectively, because of government regulations, it was impossible for Los Angeles to ever develop into a city like New York. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a number of reasons, but obviously land use and zoning is one of the big reasons. The percent of owner houses in LA is much higher than in New York, where you've got apartments. Now, I could make some cases why housing is actually preferable, but it is what it is, right? And so you've got to work with what you have. And I think LA leaders are just now coming around to the fact that maybe they need some denser development in some places.
So what can Los Angeles learn from other public transit systems? You've mentioned a few examples of other systems that seem to be doing things better than Los Angeles. So what can we learn from other peer agencies, so to speak?
I would say the biggest one is start with the board. And so I'm actually gonna go back a little bit here. The prior CEO of LA Metro was Phil Washington. And he actually did, all things considered, as good a job as, well, not as good a job, but a good job running the agency. He had an office of extraordinary innovation. He wanted different types of projects. He encouraged some of the lower cost bus solutions that we have now. And current leadership is not on that page. So, some of that is who you have for your CEO and who you've had with your board. And we have that.
So one quick interjection.
Sure.
How is it even possible that the board is populated by people that have zero transportation expertise? How did that situation even occur? That doesn't make any sense.
Well, because they are appointed by other politicians. And in some cases, it's considered a stepping stone to higher office for political folks. In other cases, it's considered political favor, for lack of a better word. There's no, the idea that folks would have to have some minimum level of transportation knowledge is just not a common thing in the transit industry. And I will say, some people will say, well, you want folks who are politically minded because they'll be able to, better get things for their constituents. And I can see that argument too. But again, we're talking about a base level of transportation knowledge, not experts.
And so, who would you say, right as of right now, you mentioned that it sounds like the primary people that use LA Metro are working class. Would you say that those are the core customers?
Yes, I think those are definitely the core customers.
And how well would you say that the agency is serving them?
Not well, because that's not where service is focused. There's there To a certain extent, buses in LA, a local bus particularly, is still treated as second class, and they're treated as second class citizens. And so buses break down more than rail. Buses have, I would say, less, more crime. Let's put it that way than rail. In similar areas, it's not working because it's not a focus.
So I didn't write down this question, so this is a little bit off the cuff. But do you have any opinions on Los Angeles' plans for Los Angeles 2028 for the Olympics?
As a matter of fact, I do. So somebody who's got a lot of familiarity with the LA region, Tom Rubin, who was actually CFO of one of the predecessor agents, and Jim Moore, who was at USC and is now retired, wrote for us back about 6 years ago this series of 15 things, all of the problems with 28 by 28. And look, LA is not building this for the Olympics, okay? If they wanted lines for the Olympics, they could come up with some type of bus service that would get people where they wanted to go. They could do some type of pricing. They could do priority lanes. They could pay people not to drive. I mean, the Olympics is just not that long, right? So that's the justification for building these systems. And I don't want to say none of them. So let me say almost none of them can be justified based on who's using the system, future ridership trends, anything like that. Especially with the population decline that the county has seen over the past 5 years. If you could make a case for them back in 2018, it's harder to make a case for them now. So these were just, we want to build these projects. The Olympics is coming up. Ooh, let's call it 28 by 28.
So I believe that Los Angeles has claimed that they're going to finance this project. It's going to be completely self-financing, that they're not going to use one dime of taxpayer resources. That's at least the claim. Are you skeptical of that idea?
If anybody who's been following this agency for any length of time really believes that, I have some oceanfront real estate, not in Kansas, but instead in Latvia to sell you.
So going back to the cost, you mentioned that LA has one of the highest cost per miles in the entire world when it comes to building rail. But if I remember correctly from your report, it also has one of the highest cost per rider. Is that correct?
That's correct, because when you have really high costs and you have relatively few riders, and earlier I mentioned that, LA, New York has 13 times more riders. So New York's not cheap to build in, but it's not 13 times as expensive. So whenever you have very few riders sharing the cost, it's going to be a really high cost per rider.
And is there any way to make it so that the revenue from Metro's operations can be used to finance LA Metro instead of the taxpayer?
Well, yes, but you'd have to, the operations is one problem, the capital cost is another. So first, you'd have to better choose your capital projects, because right now, so much of the money is going to capital. But for operations, there are other things that the agency could do. They could do transit-oriented development, which is development within about a quarter mile of a rail station on all sides. That could be sizable. I think they could get probably several $1 billion a year if they had a more extensive program. They do not have an extensive program. Many other large metro agencies do. They could work on collecting fare box revenue by putting in the hard barriers that I mentioned before. Obviously, if you've got a system and 50% of people are not paying for it, well, that's not so good. You could have some more targeted pricing. I think rail riders should be paying more. You could argue bus riders should be paying less. I don't think I'd say that. I think they should be paying what they're paying. There's a way to give discounts to lower income folks who need them. But when you think of the cost of driving in LA, not just the physical cost, but actually like the mental cost of driving in LA, I would argue that the metro system is still a very good deal, too good of a deal. So I think it's a combination of things to try to better cover the operating costs. But I will add, there is no transit system anywhere in this country that fully covers its operating costs. San Francisco pre-COVID was wildly successful at 60% of its rail costs. If this was Hong Kong or Singapore, we could do 100. In the U.S., not going to happen.
I was going to say, I think one of the reasons it's such a good deal is, if I remember correctly, I think it's $190, something like that, for 3 hours of use, and you're allowed to go anywhere in the city. I mean, the reason why it's such a good deal is because it's paid for by the taxpayers. Almost no one uses it. So if I get to participate in the system, I get to free ride off of billions of dollars of capital expenditures that have not been paid for by the people who actually use the system.
Yeah, and 190 is really low. Typically, we see prices now for a one-way rail ride of about $3. We also, in many places, have distance-based pricing. So if I want to go from my home in suburban Northern Virginia into DC, it costs me, I think, $7 on a heavy rail system in rush hour, and it varies. It goes up and down the weekend depending, but that's too low, period.
Do you know if there's been any logic or argumentation about why the fares in Los Angeles are so low compared to other systems? Is that to attract new riders, or is there a rationale behind it?
So the most common reason I've heard is because we know this is going to sound a little funny, but we know we serve a lot of lower income folks, and we can't charge them more than that because they couldn't afford it. Only, as we've discussed, they really don't do a very good job of serving those lower income folks.
So going back, you mentioned the idea of public-private partnership and partnering with ride-lift companies and other private organizations in order to produce a more efficient system. Which particular aspects, if any, of the LA Metro do you think could be privatized or outsourced? And if so, if there are any, what would the benefits of those be?
Sure. So right now, LA Metro operates a bunch of different services. They have heavy rail transit power from the third rail. They have light rail transit power from overhead wires. They have bus rapid transit, which is premium bus service on a shared right-of-way or a dedicated right-of-way, BRT light, and also on expressways, BRT freeway. They have local bus. They have express bus. They have paratransit. Okay, so that's all confusing. So I mentioned all those because I'm going to go through some of them. Paratransit. They do contract out about a third of their paratransit service. Most large agencies contract out at least 80% of their paratransit service. Paratransit is generally in a region like this, it's for the elderly and disabled. It is extremely expensive, $60 to $80 per ride. A private entity can almost certainly do a lot better than that and offer more frequent service. So the first thing is they should look at why more of their paratransit service isn't contracted out. They got to be able to do at least 80%. They should look at their bus rapid transit service. Bus rapid transit, newer technology, not as much experience in contracting, but there's no reason why a premium bus service couldn't be contracted when other types of service like commuter rail, which is not operated by LA Metro, but commuter rail is heavily contracted. I also think they should be doing more with the microtransit, paratransit, which I mentioned before. Both of those are operated by a public agency in LA. I think they could be operated, Uber and Lyft's a little bit of partnership, but I think both of those could be more privately operated. You could give folks a mobility wallet and have them spend the money on the option they see as the best fit for them. So I'm not going to go preach something unrealistic. I don't think it's going to be super successful to contract out some of their rail services, but there is a lot they could do they're not doing.
So in essence, if you're going to have a system of public transit, you should opt to give people the money so that they can use it in a way that they deem to be the most efficient, creating efficiency gains for everybody, which would involve private partnerships, rather than spending on flagship projects that no one actually utilizes.
I think you were working on that one in your head because that's exactly right.
So what is your vision for the future of LA Metro? Or in other words, how can LA Metro be reformed for a 21st century Los Angeles?
Yes. So I would say more focus on bus systems, want to hit these points that have better time connections. I would add the headways right now, even in some of the core areas, are kind of ridiculous. Like you have areas that can support 10 or 15-minute headways and often don't have them. That's not everywhere for sure. I'd also like to see more. Oh, sorry. Thank you. Sorry. I get deep in my transportation nerd talk. So headways is the time between vehicles. So if you have a bus coming at 7, you have a bus coming at 7:30, you've got a 30-minute headway. You've got one coming at 7, 7:10, 7:20, you've got 10-minute headways. So I'd like to see more automated service and pilots of automated service. Some of Metro's rail lines could be automated right now. Labor is 70% of the cost of a transit agency. We're not going to get rid of it altogether. I'm not saying that, but I do think we could get it down to 50%. Excuse me, I do think we could reduce it by at least 50%. I would say that that's multiple lines, including the Orange Line BRT. I'd like to see more off-board fare collection verification that I mentioned before. You can get a Metro card and do it that way. You can do things with your app on your phone. Everyone younger than me is now using their phone 24 hours a day. I know. So, that would be something you can get a bunch of folks to embrace. I also think they did some testing with the TAP program where you tap out to get out of the system, and that is a good option as well. I think the biggest change is actually the way that agency leadership is thinking about the system. Any entity, any transportation entity, let me talk about things I know. Any transportation entity, be it a transit system, a highway operator, an airline, a railroad, should always be looking for innovation and new technologies, both to improve service quality and also to reduce costs. I don't see current leadership as doing that right now. And I think that's a problem both for today and 5 or 10 years down the road, when if you're not looking at those types of things, it's going to be a lot worse than it could have been.
It's also very important to note that, as you can imagine, heavy rail is a fixed transportation system from point A to point B. You can never modify where that rail goes, whereas bus systems are inherently flexible and they can always cater to organic demand. So let's just say Los Angeles undergoes a crazy radical transformation and Inglewood becomes the center for commerce and all the jobs end up in Inglewood. You can very easily modify the bus system to adapt for that. But rail system, if you have a rail system you spent billions of dollars on, you will never be able to recoup that cost and adapt it to make it fit for the modern era. But
yes, I don't know if there was a question there, but I agree. Yes.
Yes, I was just going to say one more thing. Going back to the concept of headway, as I mentioned, I rode the LA Metro when I was preparing for this research project, and something I realized is the headway that I experienced had incredible wait time. So when I think it was Santa Monica Station, there was a train arriving in 2 minutes, and then the one after that was like 32 minutes. So if you don't catch that immediate one, you're going to be waiting for almost half an hour. So when you think about public transit, you want a reliable system that people know they can get from point A to point B. When you have such long headways, you don't know that, which disincentivizes people from ever riding it. There are other public transit systems around the world, in France, even in Russia. In Moscow, Russia, the train systems come every 2 minutes, and their accuracy on time, like rating, is 99.9% every 2 minutes on the dots. Versus in Los Angeles, you have 2 minutes, you have 5 minutes, you don't know, you have 30 minutes, and that is not going to attract riders.
Yes, I mean, and that's the problem of building a rail system in a place where your land use and housing characteristics it won't work, right? You have to choose the right technology. That's, and I think I may have mentioned it a few times, but that's one of the biggest takeaways, for the system that was created in LA. We have this vision in the US that if we don't have a rail line, we're not going to be a world-class city, whatever that means. We're not going to be a world-class city. That's not what's going to make you a world-class city or not, right? Like there's a lot of other things that are far more, maybe a major airport, maybe dining destinations, maybe universities. We've done studies and we've asked people, do you have a preference for rail over bus? And they say, I have a preference for whatever will come the most frequently. because I want to get somewhere and I don't want to be waiting. The worst thing to most transit riders is waiting, worse than actually being on a slow vehicle. So that sort of indicates that maybe the mode chosen here is not the right one.
And so returning to what we originally were discussing about the history of LA, Los Angeles used to be a city full of streetcars, correct?
Yes, like many U.S. cities in the 1920s, Los Angeles had a bunch of streetcars to what were then suburbs and would now be considered part of the city of LA.
Could we return to a system like that, or why did that system go away?
Well, we could return to whatever we want to, but it might not be a great idea. The reason the city went away is because the streetcars were largely funded by developers. They were a way to get folks from what were then called streetcar suburbs into business districts. The problem is these amazing things called automobiles, as well as buses, came along. And automobiles allowed you to go anywhere you wanted to go. And buses were able to go on any street, not just where the rail line is. A couple of interesting things about streetcars. Generally speaking, if you're in good shape, you can walk faster than the streetcar because the streetcar makes a lot of stops. Not saying you want to walk, although nice weather, you could walk. And if a streetcar encounters a vehicle that's in front of it, the streetcar has to wait until that vehicle moves out of the way because the streetcar has to stay on the lines. So I see, if you want to get me really started, talk about streetcars, I see no dumber technology in 2025 than a streetcar.
So in essence, heavy rail is the worst in Los Angeles, streetcar is not that much better, and then ultimately at the end of the day, buses are best because they're pure flexibility, point A to point B, no restrictions.
Hard to say worst. I would actually argue streetcars are the worst because they serve no real purpose that couldn't be served by something else. Heavy rail, in theory, in some places, maybe sort of, at least moves people from point A to point B. But buses are certainly a cost per rider, the much better option for LA.
Now, there's all different kinds and sizes of buses and ways that buses travel. So, double-sized buses, little mini buses, bus lanes. How do you differentiate what you think is best for LA?
Sure. So I might go into acronym talk again. You may have to stop me. So generally speaking, the articulated buses, which are the longer ones, are used either on routes that have extremely high ridership or on what are called premium services like bus rapid transit. And bus rapid transit either can operate in its own dedicated lane, like was the Orange Line, they may have renamed it, or it can operate in a shared right of way with things such as priority traffic signals and queue jumps to give it. So a lot of it has to do with what type of service you're offering. Local buses typically have your standard 40-foot, bus routes for 40-foot, limited stop, which are, they have fewer stops than local and operate generally mainly at rush hour. Typically will also do 40-foot. So the goal is, what is the service we're operating? And to a lesser extent, what is the ridership on the corridor?
So Baruch, after publishing this report, you also published an op-ed about the same findings about why the LA Metro received the Golden Fleece Award, and LA Metro responded. And one of their responses was that transportation is about more than moving people. What do you have to say about that?
Well, the number one goal of transportation is about moving people. Now, that's not to say you can't try to do transit-oriented development, which they're really not, but you couldn't, or there's not some, neighborhood beautification, or you're not trying to give people choices, although I would argue you could give people choices for much more cost-effective live than they are, but you have to do your number one goal, all right? I mean, I don't want to say it's silly, but it's just like so, they're looking at all of these minor things to basically deflect from the thing they're not doing the number one goal well.
So based on all these findings and your solutions, does the situation seem hopeless? Can LA Metro be reformed? It can never be shut down. Do you think that it's all actually possible to implement a sound system for Angeleno and Los Angeles residents? Or what does the future look like for LA transportation?
So I think it's possible, but it goes back to some common themes. So let me hit them again. Um, you, you got to start with the board. You got to start with the board and executive decision makers. It just makes a difference. Leadership in any industry makes a difference. This is the second largest metro area in the country. It should have the second best leadership. I will just leave it at that. You've got to come back to serving the customer. You've got to come back to incentivizing innovation. All of the things we talked about. I do believe, look, it's not going to be easy, right? Most transit agencies in this country have a lot of room for improvement. But I would point to DART in Dallas, okay? Now, DART in Dallas, they built a light rail lines that just like I had somebody who was a big light rail booster talking to me when I was on the National Academy of Sciences Bus Transit Systems Committee, and then and I served my 9 years, and they liked me, believe it or not. I don't know why. Maybe they're just being nice to me. So anyway, they built this crazy rail system. It was very expensive. They got one of the people who was worked in Denver and here under Phil Washington, very creative mind, and she went to work. She went to work figuring out how she could educate the board members and probably also maybe modify the board members. She had this sort of a kitchen cabinet of officials where they tried to reduce costs. They tried to figure out how they were going to make this light rail system functional, and innovation. So the light rail system is still a work in progress, but the other things she's done are really amazing. And I think this year, next, she will probably get the big transit management award. So yeah, you can do it. You can do it. It's not going to turn around overnight, but you got to have the right people with the right policies in place.
I mean, that makes complete sense to me. You can imagine if this was any other domain of expertise, whether it be medical expertise or any other type of regulation or system, you would require people to be experts in that field. So the fact that Los Angeles is being serviced by people of no expertise is really disrespectful to taxpayers, but also damaging to the communities in Los Angeles.
Yeah, unfortunately, in transportation, we don't always do things as if this was the medical field or the legal field. There's more politics that seeps in. Politics seeps in everywhere, but there's more politics that seeps in. And especially transit agencies, which tend to serve mostly urban communities, politics tends to be a real problem. Although Caltrans, which is the state DOT, has got its own problems, but a lot of those are union driven. So, yes.
Well, thank you so much for discussing the problems and the solutions. We will now open up the conversation to Q&A. Yes.
I'm a leadership class in Los Angeles. This is a broader question. How would you see the trends of remote work and AI impacting the composition of public transit? Very easy to locate quite as much, and a less working class part of the population might have jobs that don't exist or might not be using the metro industry at all. How does that affect revenue maximization plan?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And that was one of the big changes we saw in the Great Recession, and also one of the reasons why Metro's revenue fell off a cliff, because there are fewer, professionals, transit choices, we call them riders, using it. And so the shift should be, who are our customers today? Who are they going to be in the future? Far more people work from home now than did, multiples 3, 4 before COVID. I don't think they have actively made that change to consider that. I think they are still assuming, many transit agencies are still assuming that they are going to get back above 100% of their transit choice riders that they had pre-COVID. and the best is about 80%. And I don't see it going much more than 80%, except in places that are rapidly growing, and then it's not really 80% because they've got a lot more people to choose from. So yeah, that's a great question. It's a big challenge, and it's almost a bit psychological. I don't think transit agencies want to admit that they have to change and that their users are different now.
The financial disparities between LA Metro and other public sector transit are so wide. At least it raises the very meaningful probability of outright corruption, illegal corruption, as opposed to the legal corruption that often passes as politicking. The U.S. Attorney for the Central District of Los Angeles is investigating the Los Angeles Homeless Services Authority because of $24 billion that have been flushed to no obvious benefit. Do you have any evidence in your research of outright illegal fraud?
I don't have any conclusive evidence. My suspicion, because the numbers are so bad, is that something's going on there. But transit agencies' budgets are, the private sector would never budget like this. Let's put it that way. It's just so confusing. I know in my experience with them, when I was working on a conference, they were a total disorganized mess. People 3 offices down didn't know what the other one was doing. So there's certainly management incompetence. Outright corruption, I don't know.
You mentioned that
describe more about this loss. That seems like that of everything you described. What they argued, how they were spread, it's true and whether.
Sure. So what they argued was, and they used an obscure statute under California law, but basically the agency was tasked with serving its customers or its riders, and the agency was totally deficient. And there was a civil rights component because of a certain low income community. And so at that time, it was very clear that Metro was doing that. And so there was a monetary fine for them. And there was also this consent decree for, I want to say, something like 7 or 10 years. I don't know if Metro is quite as obvious right now in what it's doing. I think they learned the wrong lesson from the lawsuit. The lesson they learned was we're going to be less obvious, so it'll be harder for someone to prove what we're doing wrong. I would love for someone to go challenge them because I think that, not a legal expert, but I think there's enough evidence there. But to this date, it has not been duplicated.
Over the past few years, I've ridden on the metro system quite a few times, and I've noticed that as I'm paying at the machine, there'll be like dozens of people walking by me and getting on the train and not paying. I'm wondering if you've heard of anyone who's tried to calculate the amount of loss of that to the system, and would it really make any difference if they did pay?
So the estimate that I've seen, and it's very hard because LA Metro doesn't want to calculate the loss. But I know a professor at UCLA who will go nameless because he gave me this information, was that it was at least 50%. So at least 1 of 2 people were not paying. And if it increases fare box revenue, so the total amount they collect from fares, from 10% to 20%, that's still bad, but it's it's more than you had before. So I do think it would make a difference, but obviously by itself, it's not going to be a silver bullet.
Well, it would reduce the average cost per rider by 50%.
That's true.
Long-time metro rider, and even with climate disorder and public usually the people who run Metro, the board, etc., everyone is aware that there are problems. That it murdered. Yeah, I have murdered. So then is the lack of resolution problem, board not wanting to get you security guard, use of security guards not carrying out orders? Is it staff that's skeptical of use of law and order, or pressure from like for example, there's like a working group up in Echoes Public State, but in a volunteer board is supposed to do all that pressure. But I guess since you know the system, like where's the point of leverage, like the order piece?
So it's most of those things in combination. So let me go through them. So first, they weren't doing their own security. LA County was doing it. And LA County was not putting officers there because that's not where their priorities were. So that was obviously a huge problem. Then they come in, LA Metro, and they do realize they came in and put on their own force. But it took some time, and it's still taking time to sort of change patterns, because once you have certain patterns, there's kind of a culture. And you know, I'm not going to pretend to put myself in the mind of a criminal, but we're some people who are easy targets. Oh, it's LA Metro. So you've got to change that. I do think there is a share of folks in LA who thought that people who are committing crimes were just, you know, they didn't have money. And so, you know, they were just robbing these people and we can't be too tough on them. I don't think that's the majority of people on the LA Metro board or the majority of people, period. But those people were there and they did have to sort of fight them. So once this happens, it's challenging to get it down. They are trying, but they're still way above the average, and hopefully they will need to come down. Some of it is where they're spending their money. You know, if you're spending your money on these unneeded system expansions, that's less than you could be spending on your police force. You know, I do think they want to spend on the police force, but you know, like any entity, they've got to prioritize. So,
Yes, one more question.
So after the expo line was built, there actually was a lot of housing or high density housing development in Culver City, at Culver City. I don't know how granular your data is. Is there any evidence that the expo line or the buses that are there saw any increased ridership from all that development? And if not, what is the likelihood of a possibility that it have in mind that if we expand the trains, we keep building trains, then we can keep finding places where we can get over the NIMPs and build more dense housing, even though the trains aren't easy?
yeah, those are two good questions. So the first one is, it's too early to tell because travel patterns take at least a year, you know, and really 5 years in order to change. And we just don't have data that's good enough to say. In theory, based on what we've seen in other metro areas, it should make a difference, but it's probably not going to be huge. I do think the transit-oriented development is part of the justification of expanding rail lines, and I get that aspect of it, but I would say they could do it with a bus rapid transit line, just like a lot of other places in this country have done, at a much lower cost and accomplish the same goals of increasing housing.
Well, thank you, Brooke, so much for this conversation. Thank you for the valuable research that you provided. And thank you to the Reason Foundation for generously hosting us for this event. If you want to know more about what the Independent Institute does, you can go to independent.org to see the updates to the California Golden Fleece Reports awards. We have quarterly reports, so we publish a new report every quarter, finding a new entity, policy, or law that is fleecing the taxpayers of California. And we at the Independent Institute hope to keep fighting the good fight and help to make California a great place to live again. Thank you very much.
Thank you.